This week on the podcast, we welcome back Yascha Mounk. Yascha is a writer and academic known for his work on the rise of populism and the crisis of liberal democracy. He came back to talk about his new book, The Identity Trap.
Those of us who are worried about how, extreme politicians like Trump can have so much appeal should ask ourselves, why, after 10 years of warning about them, are they still able to command so much support? And perhaps rather than writing off the average American voter as, a bigot or a racist or a sexist or a homophobe and so on, we should look in the mirror a little bit and ask ourselves, what has made the Democratic Party so incapable of commanding a much broader majority against somebody like Trump.
This is Walk-Ins Welcome with Bridget Phetasy. I'm Bridget Phetasy, and you are welcome. You know the drill. Please subscribe, rate, comment, share, reach out, tell your friends, send smoke signals, whatever. We love your feedback and we want to hear from you. If you like our work and want to support us, the best way to do that is join Phetasy.com. You'll get access to behind-the-scenes content, outtakes, discounts on merch, and the ability to submit questions for some of our upcoming guests. Support your favorite scrappy little internet heroes at Phetasy.com. All right, I'm with Yascha Mounk, everybody. Welcome back to Walk-Ins Welcome. This is our second round.
I look forward to it. I loved the first time, so you have something to live up to. I do too, hopefully.
How have you been in the interim time? You've been writing a book.
I've been writing a book. I've been recovering from writing a book, and now I'm in the middle of running around talking about the book. I've been well.
Yeah. So your book, your newest book, The Identity Trap, is out, and it's actually surprising. I was. Are you going to get canceled for writing this book?
I joke that when I decided to write this book, I was sure it was going to be a bestseller, and I feared I would get canceled for it because there was a moment when just any form of criticism of this ideology was taboo in many institutions and circles. And while I really don't think that the fight is won, and I think there's been too much triumphalism about the sort of moderate amount of pushback there's been in the last 12 months or so, I do think the moment has become a little bit less toxic than it was. So, hopefully all your listeners are going to help make this a bestseller by buying The Identity Trap. Hopefully it's going to, actually get read by people because I think it's an important book. But I'm sort of less confident that it's going to sell really well, but somewhat more confident that I won't get canceled. But we'll see.
So tell us just a little bit briefly about the theme and what inspired you to write this book.
Yeah, well, I mean, what inspired me to write this book is something that I know you cover a lot in this podcast and probably many of your listeners care deeply about, which is the rise of a set of ideas about race and gender and sexual orientation over the course of the last decade that has really transformed a lot of mainstream institutions in the United States, a lot of the way that newspapers and magazines write about the world, a lot of the kind of educational practices we see in a lot of schools around the country, a lot of the basic missions that nonprofits are pursuing and not pursuing, and even the norms of corporate America, how we deal with each other in the workplace. And though there's been a lot of tweeting about it, including sometimes by me, I think that actually we haven't yet figured out where these ideas came from, how they could come to be so powerful, what the problem with the main applications of these ideas is in areas from free speech to cultural appropriation to race-sensitive public policy. And finally, what the better alternative is, how we can express our disquiet with these ideas, our opposition to these ideas, in a way that also gives its due to the injustices that exist in our societies and our aspiration to build a better country. And so that's what I set out to do.
Yeah, I sometimes feel like that's what gets lost a little bit in a lot of the conversations about the problem with these ideas is that there are existing, problems that, as you mentioned in your book, I think that the some of these ideologies come from a place of wanting to right systemic wrongs, and yet it seems like a very bad way to go about it. Often it ends up being race essentialism, and it ends up getting into tricky places where, as you mentioned even in your intro, just some of the stories about what happens with how you're determining who's getting medical care, how you're determining who's getting the $1,200 to have a basic income, or how you're dividing kids up in classrooms, that starts looking very regressive. And I do see a lot of writing about this on the right, but I've seen some pushback from, the intellectual dark web or whatever you want to call it, but there hasn't been very much from somebody I think you would consider yourself like of the left. No.
Yeah.
And why do you think that is?
Well, let me say, a few things. The first is that yes, the stakes of this are very real, and the book is not a book about cancel culture. I mean, I have a chapter in which I defend both the legal basis for free speech and the genuine culture of free speech, and I talk, a little bit in that context about the really illiberal atmosphere that has existed in many institutions, that has scapegoated people for very mild transgressions of various taboos of what you're supposed to say, or even just misunderstandings of what they were trying to say. I am concerned about all of this, but the stakes go far beyond that, and that's where I'm sort of more interested in this. Right, this goes to teachers going into classrooms at many elite private schools around the country now, when kids are 6 or 7 or 8, and telling them we're going to split you up by race. And
Right.
if you're Black, you're supposed to go over there. And if you're Latino, you're supposed to go over there. And then you have the question of what are you going to do with a white group? And you end up trying to push them to embrace the whiteness in the hope that that'll make for, anti-racist activists. And I fear that actually it's more likely to create actual white supremacists.
Right.
And we see it as you indicate in the medical context. I mean, one of the most striking things I've done was to listen to an advisory group to the CDC that was deciding on the rollout of vaccines, which was sparse at the time, and basically said we can't prioritize the oldest people first because oldest Americans are disproportionately white, and so on equity grounds we need to prioritize essential workers, and that's a policy that most states end up adopting in one way or the other, for somewhat watered down in many places.
Mm-hmm.
And that I think had the predictable result of killing more Americans, as the CDC's own model predicted at the time. And it likely killed more non-white Americans, because if you give a vaccine to 2 25-year-old Black Uber drivers rather than one 80-year-old Black retiree, more Black people are going to die. So the stakes of this are very, very real. And the reason why I called the book The Identity Trap is that I think the trap is the right metaphor here, right? A trap is something that has a real law.
Mm-hmm.
The law is this promise that if you really want to fight against injustice, and if you really want to make this country more just, then you have to get on board. And the country is unjust in important ways. And I think all of us do want to live in a better and a more just country. So there's something appealing to that. And then the second element of a law is that smart and well-intentioned people can end up falling into it.
Right.
If a trap is well laid, it is something to which everybody is vulnerable. And then finally, the trap is counterproductive. It doesn't actually allow you to do what you want. You might want that nugget of cheese, but instead you end up being stuck in the trap. And so it's something that actually is a problem for everybody. And that's, I think, what we have to understand.
What did you, when you said at the beginning that you're worried that it won't sell as much as you thought it might, and the chances of you getting canceled are lower. Why do you think that is? Is it just a topic ground that's been tread, or what makes you say that?
Yeah, I mean, I just think, when I started writing this book, there was considerable resistance to me writing it, and it just was a moment when, for various factors, including the sort of the fact that I mean, I suppose Trump was not quite in office by the time I really started writing this book, but he was still very recently had been in office and so on. But it's just a sense that the only people who could possibly criticize these ideas are people who sort of secretly are great fans of Donald Trump's,
Right.
and to be on the left, or to be somebody like I am, who's made their name in part by criticizing Donald Trump and by warning before it was cool. I like to say I'm a democracy crisis hipster. That these authoritarian populists around the world, including people in places like Turkey and India and Venezuela, are real dangers to our democratic system. If you're on that side of one debate, you can't then go and say, hey, and there's also these developments in more left-wing and more progressive circles that you're also concerned about. And so if you teach at a great university, as I have a luck of doing, if you're a fellow at a certain kind of think tank and so on, like this is just not the sort of thing that it felt like you could do. And I do think that over the last years, there's been enough realization among people of just how destructive elements of this ideology are, that has started to change a little bit. I know people who were mostly on board with a program, as it were, and then saw how it started to destroy their own institutions.
Right.
Started to lead to these huge meltdowns in many, explicitly or in de facto progressive institutions, that ended up in these big crises, and they now have very different views on this, because they say, hang on a second, there is something about this that isn't quite right. And so I just think there's a little bit more space to speak, but perhaps the fact that there's more space to speak and that it's less likely to, everyone gets canceled, then also makes it sort of less likely that it becomes this huge thing. I have no idea. I mean, I'm really optimistic actually about the uptake of this book. I think it's my 5th book, and I think it may be my best book, and so far the resonance has been great. So I don't want to understate the prospects for its success, but I just felt it just felt taboo in a way 3 or 4 years ago, or even perhaps a year or two ago, that perhaps thankfully it no longer does. We're starting to be able to have a serious conversation about these ideas, as we should. These ideas have transformed how we do things. The least we can do is to have a serious conversation about where they come from, what they are, whether they're a good idea, how we might be able to do better.
Yeah, ironically, it might become taboo again if Trump is the primary, and also ironically, if you get canceled, it might become a bestseller. So there's a little bit of a trap there too.
Yeah, well, and certainly I think the election of Donald Trump in 2016 is one of the things that allowed these ideas to take hold so much. I mean, you started even in the first half of the decade, of the 2010s, to see how these ideas escaped campus and started to really influence the mainstream. When you look, for example, at the number of times that the New York Times and the Washington Post uses certain kinds of terms that are derived from what I'm calling the identity synthesis, that started to increase very rapidly between 2010 and 2015. So it predated Trump. But certainly once Trump was elected, there was this incredibly strong fear of criticizing any left-wing idea, because you might be seen on the left as being sort of a secret admirer, a secret supporter of Donald Trump. One of the moments in researching this book when I really had a kind of realization is when I explored this literature on group psychology. And one of the things it shows is that under ordinary circumstances, groups are actually quite open to in-group critics, which is to say that they're quite open to people who've been a member of a group for a long time, say, hey, I share our mission, I share our values, but you know what, perhaps this thing we're doing is not a great idea. Mm-hmm. But that tolerance for in-group critics goes out the window under conditions of threat. When the group feels threatened, they actually end up treating in-group critics worse a lot of the time than critics from outside of the group, because then you're a traitor, right? You're secretly on the other side. You can't be trusted. And that's exactly what happened in so many left-wing and progressive institutions after 2016. When it was this understandable sort of moment and sense of threat, they said, hey, anybody who is in any way not of a program or morally impure, they need to be purged. And of course, then we had these kind of great intellectual enablers of that set of assumptions, people like Robin DiAngelo and Ibram X. Kendi, who really said, either you're with us or you're against us, right? Mm-hmm. Unless you're anti-racist, under my definition of what that means, you are a racist. There's no such thing as being non-racist. Mm-hmm. Or, DiAngelo, who says, if you disagree with the way I do my trainings, if the kind of, frankly, indoctrination that I do in these kind of trainings, so that makes you upset. Well, those white tears are just your ways of perpetuating white supremacy, right? So it becomes this kind of hermetically sealed, not somatically healed, but hermetically sealed theory against which there's no valid pushback, no valid argument. Any attempt to argue back is an indication of your moral guilt.
Yeah, I think I ran into this. This was something that this is how I feel I got caught in the crossfire of the culture wars. Was I was writing at Playboy and I started seeing things on the left, even just very simple, low-hanging fruit. Like one of the very early pieces I wrote that was even moderately culture war anything was about high heel hypocrisy, because everybody was going after Ivanka and Melania for the way that they dressed and they're wearing heels. And this was on the heels of, no pun intended, Hillary, and everybody talking about how they can't talk about what she wears and her pantsuits and stop criticizing women for their clothes, they're politicians. And I was like, well, can't we apply these standards equally? And I got eviscerated for it, told that I was like a white supremacist. And it was surprising to me too, because I thought I was just pointing out an inconsistency that would only make the argument stronger, coming from the left, if you're applying this to all women, no matter what side they're on. And I think it was one, stepping on one rake after another, essentially. And there's part in your book that is really interesting to me, because again, it personally is something I've had to navigate, of like, don't become a reactionary, because it's so easy. You start getting basically rejected by your, for lack of a better term, tribe, or your friends or family even, and people that you thought you could, speak freely around, or even, as you say, be part of maybe a critical voice in the in-group. And it's easy to just react to that and be like, well, fuck you and fuck all this. And, now you're just basically reacting and to being rejected. And that was something that I really, luckily I was sober. I have a lot of help, but I've seen a lot of people just kind of react their way right into, I don't know, just a place where it's like you're just the opposite of what you were criticizing now.
That's a problem with a kind of Manichaean way in which our public discourse now works, right? If somebody tells you, to be anti-racist is to want to abolish the US Constitution, and then you say, well, I don't want to abolish the US Constitution. I actually think the US Constitution is worth holding on to for all kinds of reasons. Then the temptation is, well, I guess I'm going to have to go in the other direction, right? And that's very much the wrong response. Coleman Hughes, who we both know and like, I think, is completely right about that. But we need a better anti-racism. We don't need to, deliver the idea of being opposed to racism to people like Candy. We need to construct our own understanding of what it means to oppose racism. And we're going to have disagreements about that. Coleman and I have disagreements about that, and Ibram X. Kendi and I have profound disagreements about that, and that's fine. But rather than saying, hey, let's oppose anything that might somehow be described as quote unquote woke, and just be on the other side of that, we need to actually operate from the point of view of our own principle, our own ideas. Emily Yoffe came up with this term of 180ism, but a lot of our politics is simply looking at what the enemy says, looking at what the enemy does, and then just say the opposite. But if you allow that to happen to yourself, you're actually giving your opponent, your enemy, a lot of agency over what you believe, right? You're always going to sort of invert whatever they say, but they actually have control over what you say and what you think. And so, I'm a philosophical liberal, not in a political sense. I'm in certain political senses liberal too, but in the sense that I believe in a political system that preserves collective self-determination and political equality and individual freedom, right? A system in which we're free to act as we want in our private lives, and we're not subject to some kind of external control from a dictator or a priest or a military general. politically and collectively, right? And so the point of his book is to think through, hey, if you have those values, if you want to build a fair, inclusive society that treats people as equals, but you also realize that a lot of the ways in which we now talk about cultural appropriation, in which we reject free speech in our public discourse, in which we make how we treat each other more and more dependent in various respects on the kind of group of which we're a part. If you're opposed to that, how can you actually formulate that critique? Not in a reactionary way, not in a 180ist way, but rather in a way that really is based on the aspirations and the principles we have for the kind of society in which we want to live.
Do you think one of the things I hear all the time is, and get accused of often, is both-sidesism? Is that something that you fear you'll hear about? Because that was, like you said, during the kind of rise of Trump, anybody who is critical of anything that might be remotely hypocritical or these ideologies being capturing all of our institutions, you would be told that you're both sidesing and that there's this kind of critical threat that, as you mentioned, you have to circle the wagons and get all on the same page and fight. But I do think that a lot of and you talk about this, a lot of the things that are animating the excitement for perhaps MAGA or feeling it is a lot of the stuff that's happening in these institutions that's been captured. So how do you navigate that?
Yeah, so look, yes, I think people will make that accusation. I think given my long track record of academic work and public writing, it's not a fair accusation. As I sort of referred to earlier, I started to warn about dangers to our democratic system actually before Donald Trump entered American politics, and before that came to be cool. I was dismissed by many political scientists because at the time the consensus in the field was that democracies like that in the United States or that in France just are not at risk and are not going to be at risk. That in rich countries that have had these democratic institutions for a long time, we can take their stability for granted. And I very consistently opposed and warned about people like Donald Trump, who, whatever legitimate grievances they might sometimes speak to, or whatever frustrations they might sometimes speak to, are not going to make the country, not going to make the world a better place. And we've seen that in other kinds of populists around the world who've gained political power. And by the way, I haven't changed my mind in the sense that if you go back to some of my early books, like The People versus Democracy, where I warn about those things, I have pages about how we should not give up on the value of free speech and how some of those ideas are misguided. So this is something that I've had as a concern for a long time. So that's the first kind of thing to say. And then the other is that I agree with you that actually, why is it that Trump is running head to head in many polls with Joe Biden for 2024? Now, I know that not every listener will agree with me. I have no hesitation in knowing which of those two people I would rather have in the White House. I have all kinds of criticisms of Joe Biden and some of the policies he's pursued, and the evident fact that he's uncomfortably old, physically and mentally.
That's a very kind way of saying it.
It's but I would much rather have him in the White House than Donald Trump. I don't have any hesitations about that. But those of us who are worried about how extreme politicians like Trump can have so much appeal should ask ourselves, why, after 10 years of warning about them, are they still able to command so much support? And perhaps rather than writing off the average American voter as a bigot or a racist or a sexist or a homophobe and so on, we should look in the mirror a little bit and ask ourselves, what has made the Democratic Party so incapable of commanding a much broader majority against somebody like Trump. And so, superficially, what I'm calling the identity synthesis, this form of identity politics and the kind of form of right-wing populism represented by Donald Trump are in opposition to each other, right? The people who like Trump and the people who embrace his ideology don't like each other. But politically, one is the yin to the other's yang, which is to say that politically, one actually strengthens the other. And what I want to avoid is a political system and a culture in which you're forced to choose between those two poles. I might
Right.
think that one of those poles is worse than the other, but I don't find either of them attractive, and I don't find either of them to be a very convincing model for the kind of society that we should build. So let's defend the ideas and the values that that allow us to answer this question in a principled way.
One of the things I've learned over the course of, I guess, 7, 8 years being lost in this shit show is that the institutional power that you talk about in this book is something that I think a lot of Americans are reacting to. So having these major institutions, the government, feeling like the media, feeling like entertainment, every HR department, every single, particularly highlighted during COVID, where people felt powerless over their school systems decisions. This has it made a lot of people question who is actually the bigger threat. If you're looking at things that really affected the average American's life, I would say that Donald Trump being crazy and annoying and, you know, driving news cycles and whatever, followed by a pandemic, followed by the past 4 or so years, Americans seem very fed up with both things. And I feel torn about which one is more of a threat, because there is so much power. You know, who's being censored, people are getting their bank accounts. It's like very strange times, and having the technology in kind of cahoots with like our government and all of these things that we saw during COVID has, I feel like, red pilled a lot more people than the opposite happened. What's your kind of feeling about where we are right now?
Well, there's a really interesting poll from the New York Times in which they try to find the different kind of tribes of Republican voters, right? Like, rather than just, thinking of, nearly 50% of the American population as one monolith, they say, all right, what are the different kinds of components of it? And, some of them are kind of what you'd expect. So there's more of a sort of traditional establishment, country club people who want relatively moderate government, who want fewer taxes and so on, right? And then there's a kind of more religious conservatives who care a lot about social morality and so on. And then there's a kind of more sort of Trumpist right that is sort of slightly different. So one of the groups that's really interesting, it's the smallest group, it's about 8% of Republican voters. So a lot of people are disproportionately non-white. Many of them consider themselves liberal or moderate rather than conservative. They're actually quite progressive on social issues, but they really are, for lack of a better word, anti-woke, right? They really feel that the Democratic Party and the establishment institutions have gone far too far in that direction in dangerous ways. And so that 8% of the Republican electorate is the smallest tribe within it, but it's the kinds of people who was voted for the Democratic Party.
Right. Like the walk away group or whatever.
Yeah, they're the swing voters. They're the ones who've changed their mind. Mm-hmm. And so if Republicans win, it will be in significant part, in large part, because of its ability to attract that group. And that helps to explain, by the way, why the American electorate has racially depolarized to some extent since 2016. Mm-hmm. Why actually today, knowing your race tells me less about who you're likely to vote for than it did in 2016. What people predicted is the opposite because of some of Trump's rhetoric and so on and so forth, right? And so I think that's very significant. Where there you see how that kind of red pilling, as you call it, or that kind of disillusion, that kind of fear about some of those practices and ideas on the left could swing the 2024 election.
Yeah, you're seeing a lot of. I had a really interesting conversation yesterday with a young woman who knows a lot of young people and has family in Queens. And she was saying that, and it's in the Asian community, and she was saying a lot of the people were kind of silently becoming red because of things that were going on in their school systems that they were seeing. And I've seen this a lot in California. You see it a lot in San Francisco. And then also just all the migration. I'm part of this, of somebody leaving California, moving to Texas, and I'm not alone. I mean, California likes to say they're not losing people, but they literally lost a seat in Congress. So I'm interested to see how that will all play out, because even though I thought for sure there would be a kind of red wave in 2018, I was very wrong about that. The what I think I also underestimate is how many people feel like their government even did the right thing with COVID. You know, they were okay with the masks. They were okay with the lockdowns in some of these blue states. So it's like a very wild time to try and predict anything, because I feel like the American individual voter is a little bit all over the place themselves. And more as we approach this election with it possibly being Trump Biden again, there's just this sense of overall nihilism that I'm hearing from people, particularly young people, about the whole system in general. I want to give your book to my dad because he always asks me, how do young people feel and how do we get here? You know, for people like my father, they're like, I don't understand this gender stuff. Like, how is this something that took over? And I'm like, I can't explain that in a dinner, you know? Right. It's like, here's Yascha's book. He'll explain it to you. Because it takes a village to explain this to somebody. What's your general feeling as someone who's in New York and you are friends with a lot of young people and you're out in you're in the discourse through the lens of your book, of this identity trap that I do think we've fallen into? You know, I don't think it's something that is like, oh, we might fall into this. We're in it. What is your sense today? Obviously, this could all change with any kind of like development.
So I think, let's take a subject like cultural appropriation, which I have a whole chapter about, right? I think, just to preview the argument a little bit, there's come to be this generalized taboo against anything that might be described as cultural appropriation, that might be described as a member of one culture, especially a more dominant one or more privileged one, in quotation marks, somehow partaking in or imitating or being inspired by the culture of another group, especially if that group is sort of less dominant, right? And I get the intuition behind that idea, because there's some obvious cases of what we might describe as cultural appropriation that are clearly unjust. So when you think of the 1950s and 1960s, white musicians sometimes stealing the actual songs of Black musicians, having huge careers with it, while the Black musicians weren't able to have those careers because they were excluded from concert halls, because they were, not allowed to sign with certain kinds of record labels and so on. But I think that using this term of cultural appropriation is really a genuine mistake and a big mistake. That when there actually is an injustice, you can describe it in much more straightforward ways, right? So in this case, what was wrong was not cultural appropriation. It was the discrimination against these Black artists, which meant that they couldn't perform in those concert halls, they couldn't sign with those record labels. That was obviously wrong. But it's really a mistake to put the kinds of forms of mutual cultural influence that are part and parcel of a healthy, vibrant, diverse society under a general pole of suspicion. We should really reject that conclusion. So I think, yes, there's cases of cultural appropriation that are bad, but they're not bad because they are a form of cultural appropriation, and we should reject that as a general worry. So how is that debate playing out, right? I think in the beginnings of it, there were a few kind of ridiculous oversteps that now wouldn't happen. There was some poor girl in Utah who wore a kind of Chinese-inspired dress to her prom, who was white, and she was just like roundly like turned on the internet, And I think now the faction of people who sort of speak against those kinds of witch hunts and for sanity in those cases has formed and has become stronger. And I just don't think nowadays that this girl would have to suffer quite as badly as she did. And you see it with some of the people who, a few years ago would post these really inflammatory things and sort of probably the silent sort of majority of people on Twitter would look at this and roll their eyes, but nobody quite wanted to engage except for a few foolhardy people. And so it looked like everybody agreed. And nowadays you can see those same kind of tweets getting ratioed and people saying, no, this is just ridiculous, and making fun of them more openly, right? So I think the more extreme forms of this thing have been curtailed, have been pushed back a little bit. But at the same time, you want to sell a script in which one of the protagonists is not of your race and gender, especially if you're part of a supposedly privileged group. Best of luck, right? You want to write a novel in which there's a variety of characters of a variety of backgrounds, and like in the real world, they're 51% good and 49% bad. Best of luck. They better be 90% good and 10% bad, right? And so the sort of natural ways in which we've come to assume that some of these taboos are normal and reasonable and should hold, right? The fact that Alison Brie, apologized and had to apologize for voicing Diane Nguyen, the character on BoJack Horseman, who is Vietnamese American, in a show in which most characters are talking animals,
Right.
Shows sort of the ways in which this has been normalized. And so I think that's where we're at, where the sort of the most absurd excesses, the most flagrant injustices no longer happen or have been walked back in certain ways. But there's also been a real normalization of the underlying assumptions, for example, that free speech is deeply problematic, or that cultural appropriation is something we should be on the guard against.
Yeah, that's a little more unsettling. It's like the fact that you can't, maybe you won't get dragged publicly because you wore the wrong costume. That's good. But the fact that these ideas have been institutionalized, and you have, what are they called? Like sensitivity readers, and an entire economy devoted to this, I don't want to say policing, but it's like this kind of censoring of art is very disturbing. I don't think that makes me feel a little bit more cynical, because I some days I feel like things are getting better, and then some days I'm like, oh no, here we are again. It's actually just gone kind of underground, and now it's more insidious. I see a lot of.
And that's why I think it's going to be a long, drawn-out fight, right? I mean, there's many reasons I wanted to write this book, but one of them is that, look, I'm a professor at a university. I care about the intellectual life. I care about our public discourse, and I think this fight is going to stay with us for 20, 25 years. For the next generation, in the same way. And I don't think, I hope a whole sort of part of intellectual history where I explain why what I'm calling the identity synthesis is not a form of cultural Marxism, and why that's a mistake. But in the same way in which for a lot of the second half of the 20th century, a lot of university departments had a fight between Marxists and non-Marxists, right? And they were rivals for academic position and for influence and for how to design curricula and for how to frame the basic world. I think for the next 25 years, that fight is going to be between people who are woke and people who are not. That is going to be the structure of competition over everything from who gets hired in the university department to what are the basic terms that the New York Times and the Washington Post and Newsweek are going to use for understanding the world, to even the kinds of internal norms of nonprofits and corporations and so on. And so that's why I think it's so important to actually take those ideas seriously, actually understand them, and then muster the best arguments against them, which are not reactionary, which are not just, oh, this is bullshit, but say, all right, I understand where this is coming from. I understand some of what makes it appealing. Here are the best responses. Here's how we can explain how you can, in fact, be exercised by the persistence of racism, in fact, be exercised by the discrimination that many people do face, by the ways in which our society is imperfect, but show that you can understand those realities, that you can do something against them without giving up on universal values and neutral rules that have allowed us to make progress historically, and that are the only real chance we have to continue to make progress in the next decades.
How do you define woke? I know I ask everyone this because everyone seems to have a different definition, but how would you define it?
Yeah, so let me give you a kind of a brief historical account and then tell you something about how philosophically I would define it, right?
Okay.
So I talk about the identity synthesis. I just prefer the term because nowadays we need some neutral term that we can all talk about, and perhaps that's the right term, perhaps something else is. I don't really care, but I just think it's important to be able to have a conversation about it. Now, historically, I was starting to say it's not cultural Marxism, right? So the idea of cultural Marxism implies that really this is just Marxism, except that you take out the category of class and you put in the category of group identity, and then you have what it is. But doing the intellectual history of this, and I'm an intellectual historian by training in part, just convinced me that it's not the case. That actually the lineage is very different. That starts with postmodernists like Michel Foucault, then goes to post-structuralists like, post-colonialists like Edward Said and Gayatri Spivak, and then finally you have a rise of something like critical race theory. And one way of thinking about the sort of main themes of these movements today is that they have an element of a thought of each of them. Now, I'm only going to telegraph this argument briefly, but Michel Foucault rejects the idea of universal truth and the kinds of grand narratives, including both liberalism and Marxism, that have historically structured our understanding of the world. So he says, be very skeptical of any kind of abstract truth or of any absolute claims to truth. And that continues to be one element of the ideology today. Edward Said seized on Foucault's emphasis on how power travels through discourses, that power is not just top down from the army or the state or the law. It's, the ways we speak and talk about the world. This podcast is an exercise of power. And Foucault and Said seizes on that insight and says, let's politicize it. Let's not just describe this, but actually use it in order to redistribute power. And if, for example, historically the West has used its discourses to colonize the East, we need to invert those discourses to empower colonized people to fight against this form of oppression. And that becomes a big theme of what you see in these movements today, right? The politicized form of discourse critique, where if you're a good feminist, it's not about getting a particular kind of law about equal treatment passed through Congress. It's about celebrating or critiquing or finding problematic the Barbie movie. That's how you do feminist politics, right? In the next step, Gayatri Spivak talks about what she calls strategic essentialism. So she says, look, postmodernists like Foucault have these critiques of essentialist categories of identity. They say actually there's no such thing as a woman. Foucault believes there's no such thing as a homosexual, even though in our terms he would have been a homosexual. He's a man who had sex with men. But those are too constraining, were not helpful. And Spivak says, yes, that's right at the philosophical level, but you know what, for political purposes, the really oppressed, what you call the subaltern, they can't speak for themselves. So somebody has to speak for them. Somebody has to speak on their behalf. And in order to do that, we sort of have to pretend that essentialism is true, even if we know that it's not. We have to have a strategic form of essentialism. And you still see that today in the way in which many woke people talk about race, right? They'll always say, well, race is a social construct, but, and then sort of after that, like little preamble, that little like acknowledgement that perhaps race is more complicated, as somebody like Thomas Jefferson Williams would argue, they then go on to say, actually the fundamental category to understand the world is through race, and that has to be front and center in everything. And then in the next step, you get the rise of critical race theory, and you get, which is neither the kind of caricature of what people on the right say sometimes, nor is it the counter caricature that people on the left then develop, where they say, well, all that it is to believe in critical race theory or to be woke is that, you want kids to be taught about slavery in schools, or you want to be honest about the fact that America has failings, which obviously people who pre-existed the tradition of critical race theory believed, and obviously I believe.
Right.
But actually, when you see the origins of critical race theory, it is very explicitly directed against the civil rights movement, right? So Derek Bell, the founder of it, decries what he calls the defunct racial equality ideology of the civil rights movement. And even though he, in a previous incarnation, had been a civil rights lawyer helping to desegregate heroically many schools and businesses throughout the American South, he turns against that work and says, we were never really working on the interests of clients. We never cared about desegregation. They just wanted to have sort of better schools and more resources. Perhaps Brown versus Board of Education was a mistake.
Wow.
Right? Perhaps we should have rejected that. Perhaps separate but truly equal would have been a better way to go. So that is really influential in the rejection that you see today of any form of neutral law of universal value. They're saying that's all just a way of pulling wool over people's eyes. We need to make how people are treated depend explicitly on the kind of group of which they are part. And then finally, you get Kimberly Crenshaw and the idea of intersectionality, which is more narrow in how she defines it, but then sort of takes on a life of its own and really comes to mean that, since you're a woman and I'm a guy, I can't understand you, right? The way in which we can communicate across boundaries of identity is really constrained. And so, if I stand at one intersection of identities and you stand at another intersection of identities, especially if you're more oppressed, I should just defer to you.
Right.
And let you decide about things. And that becomes this call to sort of decenter yourself, to delegate your judgment,
do
to
the
be
work.
a good ally by doing the work.
Yeah.
Exactly. And so you take those themes together and you have a lot of what this kind of discourse consists in. Skepticism towards absolute truth, a politicized form of discourse analysis, the embrace of strategic essentialism, which leads to some of those pedagogical practices we've talked about, the rejection of universal values and neutral rules, which leads to certain forms of race-sensitive public policy, and the sort of embrace of a form of intersectionality, which has real deep doubts about our ability to understand each other across these identity groups. Those are some of the main themes of wokeness. Now, later you can step back and say, right, can we boil it down to actual philosophical principles that really drive this? So if you think that you're not yet bored and your audience are not yet bored, I can talk you through what I think, sort of what you can boil it down to, what the sort of really fundamental drivers are. But in terms of the themes, those things together, I think, make out a quote unquote woke outlook.
Wow. That's a lot yeah. My dad asked me what woke is, and I was like, there's, as you can see just from the way you had to boil it all down, is there an elevator pitch that you would give somebody to define the word?
Yeah. So again, I don't know that it's sort of, whether or not exactly defines the word as it's used today, but I do think the core of the ideology can be boiled down to three claims, right? And the first of this is that the primary prism, the principal way to understand the world is through the categories of race, gender, and sexual orientation, right? Like what D'Angelo says, for example, is that every time a white person interrupts a black person, they are bringing the whole apparatus of white supremacy to bear on them.
Right.
Now, it might be true in very particular contexts, but it's not going to be true in other contexts, right? In other contexts, what's actually happening is that we're good friends, and sometimes we like to shout about politics.
Clearly,
and so,
Robin DiAngelo,
right?
Yeah, she's never been in a green room. Clearly,
well, and she clearly doesn't have. I mean, in general, it appears to me that she doesn't have friends of a different race.
Yeah, exactly.
Anyway, so that's the first claim, right? That like it's not context dependent. All you need to know is this person is white, this person is black, a white person dropped with a black person. That's the sort of things we need to know to understand this situation, right? The second point is the claim that any kind of universal value or neutral rule, like the Bill of Rights, right, like the core parts of the United States Constitution, they are not, they're not sincere. They're just a way of pulling wool over people's eyes, as I was saying earlier. The purpose, the function is to cloak and perpetuate forms of racial and gender and other discrimination. And that's why we've not been able to make any progress historically. According to Derek Bell, in the years he passed away in the early 2000s, America was still as racist as it had been in 1950 or 1850. And then finally, the third claim, so therefore, what we need to do is to give up on equal treatment, give up on these universal values, and explicitly make how we treat each other depend on the groups of which we're a part. So how I treat you or how the state should treat either of us should depend explicitly on whether we're male or female, white or black, this or that, right?
Right.
And so I think those three claims together stand at the core of a lot of this. Nearly every kind of other application you can derive in one way or another from these three core ideas that, race and other identity categories are the principal prism for understanding the world. Any appeal to universal values or neutral rules is just a way of perpetuating discrimination. And therefore, we should build institutions and social practices in which how we treat each other is deeply dependent on the group of which we're a part.
So fascinating. What did you learn? What's something that you learned that really stuck with you from doing your research on this book and through the process of writing this book that was maybe unexpected or changed something? Is there some opinion you had going into it that was changed?
Yeah, I'll say two things. I mean, one is that I think it's given me greater clarity for how to articulate part of my own ideals, right? Because I actually think you can respond to those three claims I just made in a really coherent way, which takes injustices seriously while holding on to the ideals that I think have helped to make America a better country than most other places in the world, and that helps the citizens of liberal democracies around the world and beyond the West as well live more worthwhile, more free lives today than most humans have enjoyed at any previous point in history. And so that's responding to each of those claims in a principled way, right? So number one, yes, of course, race and gender and sexual orientation are important for understanding parts of reality, but other things are important too. Class is also important. Religion is also important. Categories of nationhood are important. How people actually act as individuals, how meritorious they are, how decent they are, how good they are, how they treat each other, all of those things matter too. And so to understand a particular situation, we can't come in with this preconceived filter. We have to let the situation tell us how to understand it, right? Number two, yes, of course, it is possible for a society to pay lip service to grand universal ideals and actually treat many peoples terribly. That was the case in America for a long time with slavery and Jim Crow. But these ideals have actually allowed us to make tremendous progress. There's a grand tradition of Black American thought from Frederick Douglass to Martin Luther King Jr. to Barack Obama of people saying, hey, we haven't lived up to these ideals yet, but we're determined to live up to them. That's why Frederick Douglass defended the Constitution, even as he criticized the hypocrisy of his fellow citizens celebrating the 4th of July while slavery was still on the book. It's why he called free speech the dread of tyrants, rather than like so many progressives today, sort of decrying it as a somehow conservative value. That's why Martin Luther King insisted that the check that had been written to African Americans that had never been honored be cashed rather than ripped up.
Right.
That's why Barack Obama, titled his most famous speech and most moving speech about race as a quest for a more perfect union. And so we should, aspire to build a society in which how we treat each other actually depends less rather than more on the groups of which we're a part, in which your opportunities and life chances and perhaps how you think about the world is less dependent on the group into which you're born rather than more so. So I think I've sort of understood more about how to respond to these ideas. And the other thing I will say is that, I fundamentally disagree with many of those theorists I mentioned that I chronicle in the first part of the book with Foucault and Said and Spivak and Bell and Crenshaw. But I think they're serious thinkers who you can read in a way that helps you understand the world, even if you have fundamental disagreements with them. And I enjoyed reading the work. And I also enjoyed realizing that many of them came to be critical of what became of their ideas. Edward Said wrote movingly once that the point is not to encourage and celebrate victimhood. The point is to create a world in which there's fewer victims.
Right.
Spivak, who's of Indian origin, made a joke, a pun based on tea wallahs, the people who sell tea in the streets of India, and made fun of the identity wallahs at American universities, who sort of humorlessly insist on these identity categories. So I actually have come to respect many of those thinkers. I'm much more worried about the vulgarized, popularized version of these ideas of the identity synthesis that then really enters the mainstream through social media and through the capture of these institutions and through the writings of people like D'Angelo and Kendi over the course of the 2010s.
Yeah, it's interesting. I have a lot of younger relatives, nieces, nephews, and they seem to be reacting to it. They all grew up with it. It was in their college. It was in their high schools. They've been online gaming. They grew up in this kind of quote unquote idea, like cancel culture for lack of a better term, but also just with all of this theory, it was a part of the kind of air that they breathe everywhere. And they seem to be, I mean, it's somewhat heartening in that there seems to be some kind of immunity to the, just on its face, some of the ridiculousness of it. So I remember they were using terms like woke like 8 years ago, almost jokingly. So once I heard them using it jokingly, and then I saw it kind of make its way to like mainstream Fox boomers, I was like, this term it means nothing anymore. You know, the kids are already using it, and the boomers have kind of co-opted it to point at something that's, the frustrating thing is that it points at something, as you very articulately explained, that is insidious and kind of everywhere, except it's very hard to define because it requires a degree in political science and philosophy. And so it is easy to be like, oh, this woke nonsense. And for lack of a better term, I can see why somebody who's maybe in their 70s and is now faced with grandchildren who are, you know, non-binary or whatever, like trying to get their minds around this, there's no, how else would you explain it? And right. The gender thing is really interesting to me. It feels very much like the tip of the spear of all of this for a reason, because it feels to me, just from what I can observe and sense or intuit, is that we've moved from the CRT stuff. It's there, but it's more now. The focus feels to me like on all the gender stuff. What are you sensing as you've kind of observed this? It feels like it's weird to me too, just the transition away from class. You know, it seems very obvious to me that there's class is a huge part of this. This, like you said, it's all private institutions, these elites who are kind of adopting this vernacular, and, you know, their kids are all trans and et cetera. It seems very much like a elite thing. So it's strange to me that there isn't a larger discussion around the class. That seems like it's been removed.
Yeah, so I think on class, you know, that is part of the problem with this framework that only looks at the world through one kind of context, right? I mean, ironically, the problem with Marxism historically has been that it only wants to see class, right? That it wants to explain even, you know, for example, you know, national movements for independence in class terms, because it thinks that, you know, the principal motor historically of political events is economic interests. And, you know, the big question of history is when the proletariat is going to reach the kind of class awareness it needs in order to stage those successful revolutions. You know, apparently it never quite reached that class consciousness in most parts of the world. But that was wrong by only looking at class. And in the same way, I think this ideology is wrong in only looking at the world through the perspective of these kind of identity categories, right? And so you can have, for example, you know, a form of affirmative action in the United States in which, you know, having, you know, lots of descendants of a Black CEO be at a, you know, big business school looks like a, you know, huge win for some kind of equality. And I can see that in one sense it is, and from one perspective it is, given American history, but without any real awareness of the ways in which class privilege then gets perpetuated by that. And, you know, that's good, you know, class-based critics of that, like Adolf Reed, who make those points very clearly, and I talk about those in the book. as well, right? So the right way to understand the world is to see that it's complicated, but there's
Yeah.
different kind of categories we need to think about it, including class and those identity categories and plenty of other things besides. But yeah, I mean, look, one of the things I really aim for in this book is to give an explanation of what this ideology is, that is more subtle and it helps us sort of grab our head around it, right? And so, I really hope that listeners to this podcast will read the book, because I promise you that even if you thought about this topic a lot, there's going to be things that you discover in it, that you come to understand better in it. But I also encourage listeners to think about who in your life might profit from the book, in the sense, and I'm not just saying this to sell copies, but one of the things I really wanted to do with this is that if you have somebody you can talk to, right? A sibling who is a little bit more tempted by these ideas, but hasn't gone off a deep end or anything. Something like this book could be a good basis for discussion, because it's not polemical. It tries to explain these ideas in a fair-minded way, and then it offers a serious critique of them, right? But if anything is going to get us actually talking to each other within families as well, within friendship circles, about the kind of society that we should build, I hope it's this.
I love that. Well, I asked the same 2 questions at the end of every podcast, and you've already answered them, but I know the answers change over time. So what is your biggest defect of character?
Oh, wow. I wish that I remembered what I'd said last time. I always, when people are asked these kinds of questions, and perhaps I did mention that last time, I always have to think of Hillary Clinton being asked in 2008 what her biggest weakness is.
What did she say?
Barack Obama, it was both Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama were asked this in a head-to-head, primary debate. And Obama gave, I think, a good answer, which is, I have trouble keeping a clean desk, which sort of, obviously you want to give an answer that, is genuine, but you don't want to say, I'm unfit to be president of the United States. Right? I mean, the Hillary campaign actually, sadly, tried to attack him on this in a kind of ridiculous way. But Hillary said, well, my problem is that I just care too much.
Right.
I just care too much about the well-being of the American people.
Right.
Like, oh my
I'm
God.
too humble.
So I'm trying to say, how do I answer truthfully that without, what's my biggest moral defect? Well, here's one, right? I think if I think about it seriously, I think I probably should be a vegetarian. I mean, it's hard to justify the amount of cruelty that's involved in industrial farming, particularly. Perhaps
I actually really relate
exceptions.
to that answer.
Yeah, but there's sort of a limit to how moral you can be about everything. And I love eating meat, and I grew up eating meat, and I think if I really allowed myself to stop to think about it, I think I probably would end up being a vegetarian, and yet I'm very much not. So that's a serious moral failing.
Interesting. I think,
and it's not just the moral failing of not. Sorry, I'm still referring. It's not just a moral failing of not being a vegetarian. It's a moral failing of not quite wanting to think about whether I should be a vegetarian, because I'm afraid of what conclusion I'll come to.
And it's not just vegetarian. If you really go down the rabbit hole, you'd have to probably become vegan, because the cheese and egg industry is not. The dairy industry is not great either.
Well, great. Now I'm definitely not going to think about it.
Yeah, cheese and eggs are out too. Sorry, sir. I think about that a lot, actually. And then I'm like, well, maybe if I know where my food's coming from and it's locally sourced, and, is that like a loophole in is it just stay away from the industrial farming?
Well, that wouldn't have to be a loophole, right? I mean, perhaps that is the principled position, to say, humans have always eaten meat, and there's nothing in principle with wrong with principle of eating meat, as long as you make sure that those animals have a somewhat decent life, and that you avoid excess cruelty. But of course, that's very hard to do, right? I mean, when you would be a sort of occasional carnivore, that when you're on a farm or something like that, you don't mind imbibing, on it occasionally, but most of the time you don't know where it comes from, and probably the vast majority of stuff I eat does have a very cruel origin.
Yeah, I see this a lot, actually, as one of the things when people say what's something we're going to look back on as like, with just like unbelievable disbelief about the way, one of the things is the industrial farming. I see that over and over, that in a certain amount of time we'll look back on this and be like, how could they have lived like this? What's your biggest asset?
I think my biggest asset is probably my psychological fix point, which is to say that, psychologists believe that most people just have a particular kind of disposition. They're either pretty happy most days or pretty unhappy most days. Now, what's also true, as Jonathan Rauch has argued in a really interesting book called The Happiness Curve, is that actually there's a kind of shape to that across age. And in fact, it's a U shape. So in sort of your late youth and early middle age, you're often the least happy. And I felt a little bit of that in various ways as well. But it's off of a pretty high base point. On the whole, I just wake up in the morning and I'm in a pretty decent mood. I obviously know of people and have friends for whom that's not the case. And, that makes life very hard. And so I'm just, I think that's my biggest asset. I'm just very lucky in not facing that struggle. I'm very grateful for that.
I love that. I feel that too. Actually, I can really relate to your answers. I feel lucky. I wake up and I'm pretty, like my baseline is pretty optimistic, I think, generally. I mean, if I spend too much time online and engaged in the culture wars, that changes pretty quickly. But I don't know. We're entering into a time with the election season or cycle that I'm worried about people. There's this like nihilism that's permeating kind of the entire discourse, and just the feeling of hopelessness and helplessness, and seeing this idea that America's in decline, which is being repeated on debate stages. And it feels like it is, even if the metrics show you that it's not. And I just worry about people's mental health going into another election cycle, because it seems like these two people are kind of in decline. So it feels like very representative of where the national kind of ennui is.
Yeah, ennui is the right term, because it's a bizarre mix of boredom and dread. Right, like 2016, much as I was horrified by that election, there was something carnivalesque and new about it, right? There was something really compelling about Trump as a cultural figure even, right? But at this point, he's just not, he's not even interesting, right?
Right.
It's just, and it's gone from sort of making grand promises about America that I never believed he would keep, but that actually offered people some amount of hope in parts of the country in a paradoxical kind of way, to just, I've been wronged and I'm going to take my revenge.
Grievance.
And then on the other hand, there's this kind of tottering, symbol of the establishment, limping across the finish line. And it's pretty damn depressing.
Yeah.
Let alone how depressing the following 4 years might turn out to be.
Yeah, I know. That's why I was, people ask me what I'd like to see. I'm like, well, at least like DeSantis and Newsom represent the ideological battles that are taking place in our country. At least they're of the time. I feel like they represent where we are more than these older ideas. So I'd at least like to get our leaders out of the silent generation.
Well, that's what that, by 2028, in one way or another, that
will be happen, forced.
Oh my God.
Oh gosh. Well, Yascha, it's always a pleasure. Thank you for your time, and thank you for your efforts.
Thanks for ending this conversation on a depressing note. It was a great conversation, but the end is terrible.
No, because I've been thinking so much about this. I just wrote a column about it. Just like the way that I'm feeling is, I like I said, I wake up optimistic, but I really have to fight kind of this nihilism that is not, that even as someone in recovery, it's just so bad for me because that leads to like, well, none of this matters. And that leads to like, fuck it. So, and I don't think I'm alone feeling that way. When I talk to young people, there's a real sense of frustration and disappointment and, despair and all kinds of feelings just facing this kind of option that everyone feels like is almost being forced down their throats. It's just right. And so I have to ask myself, like, what can I do? Is there anything, or do I just kind of sit this one out and go, I trust America will be okay? That's how I'm ending this on that optimistic note. We've been through worse.
Thank you for your touch of optimism.
Where can we find you in your book?
So the book is called The Identity Trap, A Story of Ideas and Power in Our Time. Please do help me, make this a bestseller despite my skepticism, my minor skepticism. I think it could become one.
You need to get canceled.
I don't want to get canceled.
I know, I'm just kidding.
I know people have gotten canceled now. You can get the book anywhere you normally get books. You also can subscribe to Persuasion, which is the magazine I run that stands for many of the ideas that I've been talking about today. Please come and sign up at persuasion.community. And I have a podcast called The Good Fight.
Love it. Thank you.
Thanks.
Keep in touch. It's time for the weekly check-in with Bridget and cousin Maggie. Well,
how you doing, Bridget?
I'm tired. The baby was awake in the middle of the night. She always knows when I have to record in the morning.
Have to be on camera. She's like, let's give mom no sleep.
I swear to God, too. And it's like, I was writing last night, so I was up late, and I will finally be like drifting off to sleep, and my eyes will close, and I'll go into sleep, and then I'll hear, and then it's like she knows, and she wakes up. I'm like, unbelievable. Murphy's Law.
Well, we were also up late last night doing our first TikTok post. And Bridget was like, I think I've hit rock bottom.
I know. I want to post it on Twitter and be like, I've hit rock bottom. Please follow me on TikTok.
You should.
Just so we can post a link in there.
And the most hilarious thing is that I'm in charge of it.
China Maggie. I figured that she would be the best person for the job.
Yeah.
I can't get addicted to TikTok. I'm already addicted to the most psychologically destructive app on this entire planet.
But last night someone was like, "Oh, I'll put it on my reel or something." She was like, "Are there reels on TikTok?" I was like, "I don't know."
Story, yeah. I was like, I don't know.
Like, I'm a babe in the wilderness here. I have no
Maggie
idea
has
what
no
I'm doing.
social media, and I'm like, how about you take over our TikTok? Like the most insane pudding brain melting of all of them.
So we'll see how that goes. If we only have like 3 videos, you'll know why. But we posted our first one.
It's at Phetasy.
Yeah.
Yeah, I know I'm making a lot of people mad on Instagram because I haven't been that active on Instagram, but I've been trying to be more active. And then I posted that
clip
reel, and I like woke up because my phone was vibrating. I usually don't have notifications on, and I didn't even know I had my Instagram on because I don't engage that much. And it was just like angry comment after angry comment. I was like, oh boy.
The reel, you put the Manosphere clip up, right, on Instagram as well as on Twitter. We also put that on TikTok. So
it's really, what's sad to me is how humorless everyone's become.
I know.
They cannot laugh at themselves. They can't laugh at the insanity. They can't laugh at the discourse. Everything is a personal attack. They can't laugh at any of it. They can't recognize that I'm like simultaneously making fun of them and feminists and myself all at the same time.
You're making fun of men and women and everyone.
And me.
Yeah, all at once.
I mean, I think it's pretty high level comedy, if I do say so myself.
It's so funny to me. Reading the YouTube comments, I'm always like, it's amazing to me what people hear from what you're saying, like what their filter is and what they take in. Because a lot of the stuff, they're like, arguing with you about something, and it's
a
like,
straw man, though.
I said that. Like, you literally would have made that their own argument in what you were talking about and acknowledged that people feel this way and that you understand it, and they're still like arguing it at you. It's really weird.
I had one yesterday where I posted something like, it was an old tweet that I retweeted because everyone was being humorless. And I was saying to Jaren, I'm like, I really just don't think people are having enough sex. Like,
No,
I
it's
really
true.
think this is a big part of the problem. And the manosphere versus the femalosphere or whatever woman sphere, it's so much. And you read the statistics and like no one's having sex and the men are so angry and the women are just so bitter. And yeah, so I retweeted this tweet where I was like about how people,
A lot of you haven't been laid in a long time, and it shows, or something like that.
Yeah, and somebody was like, say that to the feminists, and it's like, you don't even realize that you're projecting,
Right. That this was a treat for everyone, including the feminists.
Took it directly as an attack on you personally, and I meant it for everyone, and women included, but you only filtered it as men.
Yeah.
Like, that's a you as Ben Shapiro would say, that's a you problem. It's wild. Yeah, and then just after like this weekend going, like, I was getting texts and going viral because I was making fun. I think, again, this is why so many years ago I was like, hello, new followers, I'll only disappoint you, because I think people will think that I'm on their team, and then
Right, because you'll say something and people will agree with it. So then they're like, hooray, she's on our side.
But the minute that you're like, hey, I'm calling this thing that I see out, and maybe I do lean more towards a side. I mean, the left wouldn't consider me left wing.
No, God, they're like, get the fuck out of here, Nazi.
Yeah. So if they can, so they would consider me right wing, and the right wing maybe is like, okay, we're opening our tent up to take these whores in. And then there's like all this discourse that I see happening that is shifting the vibe. I'm like, you guys don't see it. One, because you're men, and two, no offense, and two, because you don't have the DMs that I have,
right,
and you don't have the reach that I have, so you're not hearing from the number of people that I'm hearing from. And these people are reasonable independents in swing states.
Right.
And there are women telling me that they're either going to sit the election out, or that they're like disgusted with the way the right is talking about certain things around women. So you have all this goodwill that you've kind of stacked up post-COVID, post-wokeism, where you had lots of Gen X women who were repulsed by the gender ideology stuff, reluctantly being like, meh.
Maybe the Republicans aren't these like crazy people I've built them up in my head to be.
Which I was not thinking anyway, but being a writer at Playboy, I always kind of looked at them side-eyed, knowing how they actually think of women who are promiscuous, or women who, it's like, you can't, I'm a married mother with a child. I'm exactly the kind of person that you would think they want coming into their party. And you're talking about, but I have a drug addicted, promiscuous past. And my entire Instagram feed is moms my age or younger talking about how they'll be the meme of like me thinking about how me and all my girls who used to club are now productive moms, you know, like,
right,
just living our best lives. And I'm like, you are alienating suburban moms. You think all these suburban moms were just fucking virgins?
Right. You're like, you're talking to my generation now, which is a lot of the women who, and younger, who grew up with this past.
Yeah. Who were party girls.
Yeah.
Like a lot of them.
And now have become moms and like suburban housewives and all the things, but they still aren't like
body count. And the minute you start talking like that, women are like, go fuck yourselves. And it is reminiscent of the Republican Party that many of us grew up with, which is the moral majority and lots of shaming. And you would think the right wing would have learned that shaming doesn't work in politics because they tried to shame everybody out of voting for Trump. And that only made Trump stronger. So you're going to like, also, you guys think you just invented slut shaming? Like, this shit's been around for thousands of years.
As old as humans are.
Like, and then in my mentions, it's literally like repeal the 19th Amendment. I'm like, hey, the right has a woman problem. And I know that Twitter mentions are not representative, but then it's like repeal the 19th, repeal the Jews. Somehow it comes down to like,
I saw that interaction.
You're like, oh my God, you guys are not doing yourselves any favor because we've talked a lot about this on the podcast, but the right, this is but the right.
Right.
What you're seeing, what the vibe shift that I'm witnessing is people going, oh no, they're all still they're fucking still all, it's still fucked up, racist, misogynistic, whatever, like Nazi party.
Right.
And I don't actually think that's the case, but if you're trying to make the argument that that is not who you are, the people who are out there speaking for you are not doing you any favors. And people will get mad at me and be like, oh, Bridget, blah, 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 call me a whore, talk about my past. I'm like, that's really great. Congratulations. This does not matter. Like, you can personally attack me all day long. It only A, reinforces everything I'm saying, and B, you're still not listening to what I'm saying.
Right.
You're still going to lose
elections. You're still
elections.
missing the point. I mean, the number of repeal the 19th that I've been seeing lately, and I'm not on social media very much, but I didn't used to see it when I would go check your Twitter and stuff like that. And it's been like all over the place lately. And I'm just kind of like, we were talking about it in the dumpster fire thread last night, our text chain. I was like, I get that a lot of people are saying it maybe hyperbolically, or maybe as a joke, or maybe as like
14-year-olds just being trolls,
whatever. But I think a lot of people, it's like you've said before about Trump, online people are allowed permission to be the worst version of themselves because they're anonymous and they can just say whatever they want. But if you talk that way enough, you eventually believe what you're pretending to be. Like, you eventually become who you're pretending to be on your online persona, and your regular person persona become more and more similar.
Yeah, I mean, maybe. I think there has been like, the effect was usually that you became something you weren't online, and it didn't really work in the reverse. But then I think after the pandemic, with everyone being locked up, like, they forgot how to behave and be polite and have manners and be social.
Because they were just so online.
Yeah. And I think with kids, they're so impressionable. There's this video going around of this influencer, TikToker, right-wing manosphere guy. And all of these young kids were coming up to him and they were like, yeah, women suck and fuck the, like, gays are bad. It was like all this homophobic, misogynistic stuff. And he was kind of like, oh, looking at the camera, like, what did I create? And it's like, well, even if you're playing that online, young, impressionable kids are going to absorb that. And
think it's the truth.
Or think it's funny, like the edgelording thing is like, haha, it's hilarious. And it's not, I don't know. I've heard from many conservative right-wing women who they always confide in me in these moments, who have reached out to me and been like, I don't know if it's the algorithm and I'm just seeing more of this stuff, or it's like gaining popularity, but the stuff that you are pointing out is absolutely true, but none of these women can say it because this is what so many people don't understand who aren't in my position. I say things no one can say because they're afraid they're going to lose their audience.
Right.
And you can't lose an audience if you don't have one.
And the very hardcore small group of people who does follow us loyally knows what they're getting. They're willing to hear both sides.
Yeah, and they know that I'm not right, and I'll call myself out on it when I'm not, and I've been historically wrong about everything, so maybe I'm wrong about this, but I don't think the majority of people are actually being radicalized. I think it's the very online people who are being radicalized. But what's funny, and I want to write something about this, like watching watching the right wing kind of get red pilled or whatever it is themselves, there's something just hilarious about it to me because they're chasing clicks and audience and money, and it's that negative kind of feedback loop that you get into. So they think like, oh, well, put this video out about body count and it'll get a lot of traction, and it will, except you guys aren't speaking to, you're not winning elections doing this. You're just making money.
Right.
And you're chasing like, they see guys like Andrew Tate who are making $5 million a month on his like pimps and his like hustler university or whatever.
Oh my God.
They want that money too.
Right.
It's like, it's all subscriber dollars. So they're the incentive to continuously go further down a rabbit hole
for shock value and for clicks.
They're like self-radicalizing and they don't even see it. And it's not good. It's not good for them. And I do see a vibe shift. Like there's so many women in my mentions who are like, well, I guess I have to get my blue hair dye out and see if I can get my establishment card back. But you don't want to go back there either because they can't even fucking define what a woman is.
And yeah, I know.
It's not good. It's not good.
I know.
It is not. The process leading into the election is not good. Yeah. So we're just going to feed the algorithm with a bunch of disconnected dumpster
that
fire
makes us laugh.
rants that make us laugh, and I don't care anymore. That's the other thing I've really sensed, particularly from women, is they're like, I am completely out of fucks. I think there is like a natural instinct for women to want to be protected somewhat. And the instinct led them to the Democratic Party for many years, feeling like it gave them more bodily autonomy. The social services were better for single moms, even if those policies created those single moms, something I didn't ever have to really look at when I was pro-Democrat. And now you're seeing these policies that create very dangerous cities for women and children and elderly. And you're just seeing the effects of a lot of these policies, not to mention the gender ideology, which I think is a crime against humanity.
And then you've got...
I just sounded like Obama, which is a crime against humanity.
And then you've got the right being like, repeal the 19th. It's just like, I read a comment.
But they're like those, I don't want to mistake like the commentators in like Reddit and on... I can't compare that to the establishment.
No, and people who are like making policy, but
yeah, because they're not even close to the same, and that's why there's such this huge reaction. But I don't think the pundits who represent the right are doing themselves and their party any favors by parroting these talking points that are taking place like online in the manosphere that are disconnected from anyone really wanting to win elections. It's not fair to compare like these sad little scrappers kind of fighting against the big tech and that's where I really understand the feeling of the underdog and the right not really having any true power in the way that the left does to pull the levers of
like society.
Yeah, we've seen this. So I understand the argument of like, yeah, but you say, but the right. But if the right is always saying politics are downstream of culture. And if that is the case, you should care about what you're putting out there culturally. And if you're out there having discussions about a woman's body count and like, your ginormous fan base is out there yelling to repeal the 19th, and you're veering into the moral majority but a godless version, which is even more terrifying, and you're veering into those purity tests that they were known for, and again they got away from that,
and somehow still their king is like the most shameless man alive.
They had so much goodwill post Trump and post woke, like people leaving the left, and they really they don't want to take any responsibility for the fact that they're squandering it, but they really are.
Yeah. And I would say, too, I do want to acknowledge there are a lot of moderate Republicans out there who don't feel this way, who Trump's not their guy, who,
totally.
are.
But they're called cocks.
Right.
I mean,
they feel just as helpless as probably we do in this situation.
And voiceless. Yeah. Yeah. And most of the people would say they're ineffective. And I'm not really sure. This could be the end of the experiment. You know, people like it reminds me of when we saw Colin Quinn and he's like, you go to these democracies and you're like, oh, this is the like birthplace of democracy and it's rubble. And you're like,
and it was like democracy for X number of years. And then it was like an empire for X number of years.
Like inevitably.
Like a king became involved again.
Self-destructs. It was such a like funny and terrifying and insightful bit.
Yeah.
Between his stand-up and talking to Helen Joyce today and what I'm seeing, I'm like, yeah. Time to move to Portugal.
Bridget's solution for everything.
Tune in next week for another riveting episode that will change your life, help you get out of your own way, and solve all the world's problems. I want to thank our composer, Jared Elias, my co-producer and cousin, Maggie, and all of you out there listening. This has been Walk-Ins Welcome with Bridget Phetasy. I'm Bridget Phetasy, and you're welcome. It's the dumbest line.